The Black Hawk helicopter sliced through the smoke-filled Afghan sky, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air like a mechanical heartbeat racing toward death. Below, the rocky terrain stretched endlessly, dotted with hidden caves and insurgent positions that had claimed too many American lives. At the controls sat Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez, her hands steady on the cyclic despite the chaos erupting around her aircraft. Radio chatter crackled through her headset, urgent voices calling for immediate extraction, wounded Marines trapped in a kill zone, enemy fire intensifying by the minute. Phoenix, we've got 8 Marines pinned down in grid 41S MD 12345 67890. The voice of Colonel Richards cut through the static. Heavy contact, multiple casualties, you're our only bird in range. Sarah's jaw tightened as she processed the coordinates. She knew that grid square, a narrow valley surrounded by elevated positions, a perfect ambush site that had earned the nickname Death's Door among the troops. It was exactly the kind of mission that her instructors at flight school had whispered she'd never be able to handle, the kind that separated the pilots from the legends. Copy that, Control. Phoenix inbound, ETA 12 minutes, she responded, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This wasn't supposed to be Sarah's story. Growing up in a small farming town in Nebraska, she had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, spending her summers helping her father tend to cattle and horses on their modest ranch. But everything changed the day she witnessed a medical helicopter landing in their neighbor's field, racing against time to save a man who had been crushed by farm equipment. As she watched the crew work with precision and purpose, something ignited inside her. A calling that would eventually lead her thousands of miles from those peaceful cornfields to the most dangerous skies on Earth. Her journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. When Sarah first announced her intention to join the Army and pursue aviation, the reactions ranged from skeptical to downright dismissive. Her high school guidance counselor had suggested she consider more suitable career paths. Her own uncle, a Vietnam veteran, had pulled her aside at a family barbecue and told her that combat aviation wasn't a place for women, that the physical and psychological demands would break her before she ever saw real action. "You don't understand what it's like out there, Sarah," his weathered hands gripping her shoulders. "When bullets start flying and men are dying, you need someone who can handle the pressure, someone who won't freeze up when it matters most." But Sarah had never been one to back down from a challenge. In high school, she had been the first girl to join the wrestling team, enduring months of skeptical stares and hushed conversations before proving herself on the mat. She had worked 3 jobs to pay for flight lessons at the local airstrip, spending every free moment studying aerodynamics and flight mechanics. By the time she graduated, she could outfly instructors twice her age and had logged more solo hours than most commercial pilots. The Army recruitment process had been its own gauntlet of doubt and discrimination. During her initial interviews, one recruiting officer had actually suggested she consider becoming a mechanic, claiming that the support roles were where women could make their greatest contribution to the war effort. Sarah had smiled politely, thanked him for his time, and walked directly to the Air Force recruiting station next door, where she received a markedly different reception. But even in the Air Force, the whispers followed her. Flight school at Fort Rucker had been a crucible of physical and mental challenges designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the pressures of combat aviation. Sarah had excelled in her academic studies, mastering complex flight systems and tactical procedures faster than most of her male counterparts. Her simulator scores were consistently in the top 5% of her class, and her instructors grudgingly admitted that she possessed an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that couldn't be taught. But it was during the live fire training exercises that the real skepticism emerged. Combat flying wasn't just about technical proficiency. It required split-second decision-making under extreme stress, the ability to compartmentalize fear and operate effectively while people were shooting at you. Many of her fellow trainees openly questioned whether a woman could maintain that level of composure when lives hung in the balance. "It's not personal, Martinez," her flight instructor Major Thompson had explained after one particularly intense training session. "But out there, you're not just responsible for your own life. You've got crew members depending on you, ground troops counting on you for extraction or support. When someone's bleeding out and calling for help, hesitation kills." Sarah had understood the subtext clearly. Women were emotional, prone to panic, likely to crack under pressure. It was an assumption that had followed her through every phase of her training, from basic flight school through advanced tactical instruction. Even when she graduated near the top of her class and earned her wings, there remained an underlying current of doubt about whether she would perform when the stakes were highest. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had done little to quiet those whispers. Initially assigned to routine transport and supply missions, Sarah had spent months flying relatively safe routes, ferrying personnel and equipment between secure bases. While these missions were important to the overall war effort, they hardly provided opportunities to prove herself in combat situations. Her male counterparts, meanwhile, were regularly assigned to more dangerous missions: close air support, medical evacuations under fire, special operations insertions. The disparity had not been unnoticed by Sarah, but she had chosen her battles carefully. Rather than filing complaints or making waves, she had focused on excelling in every mission she was given, building a reputation for reliability and precision that gradually earned her more challenging assignments. She had volunteered for every available training opportunity, cross-trained with different aircraft types, and studied enemy tactics with an intensity that bordered on obsession. It was this preparation that had led to her current situation, racing through hostile territory toward 8 Marines who needed someone crazy enough to fly into an active firefight. As she approached the coordinates, she could see the telltale signs of a battle in progress: muzzle flashes from elevated positions, smoke rising from the valley floor, and the distinctive dust clouds kicked up by explosions and automatic weapons fire.
The radio crackled again, this time with the voice of Staff Sergeant Mike Bulldog Peterson, the Marine squad leader trapped in the kill zone below. His transmission was punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of rocket-propelled grenades. "Phoenix, this is Bulldog Actual. We've got 3 urgent surgical, 2 priority, and we're running low on ammo. Taliban's got us pinned down from 3 sides and they're closing in. We need immediate extraction. Over." Sarah could hear the strain in Peterson's voice, the careful control of a professional soldier trying to maintain composure while his men bled around him. She had worked with Peterson's unit before during her earlier, safer missions, and she knew him to be a seasoned veteran who didn't rattle easily. If he was calling for immediate extraction, the situation was desperate. "Roger that, Bulldog. I'm 2 minutes out. Can you give me a tactical situation report on enemy positions?" "Phoenix, we've got heavy machine gun fire from the northern ridge, approximately 300 meters. RPG team on the eastern slope, maybe 250 meters out. And we're taking sniper fire from multiple positions to the south. The LZ is hot. Repeat, the LZ is extremely hot." As Sarah crested the final ridge before the valley, the full scope of the battle unfolded before her. The Marines had taken shelter behind a cluster of boulders near the valley floor, their position marked by the green smoke grenade that Peterson had popped to identify their location. Around them, the landscape erupted with muzzle flashes and the impact of incoming rounds. It was exactly the kind of scenario that had figured in her worst training nightmares, a complex multi-threat environment where a single mistake could result in catastrophic casualties. Sarah's crew chief, Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez, moved up behind her shoulder to survey the scene. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had flown more combat missions than most pilots ever dreamed of, and his experience was evident in the calm, methodical way he assessed threats and calculated risks. "Ma'am, that's a tight LZ with heavy fire from multiple directions," Rodriguez said through the intercom. "We're going to be exposed on approach and departure. Those RPG teams have clear lines of sight on our flight path." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through tactical options. A standard approach would take them directly over the eastern slope, where the RPG team was positioned, a recipe for disaster. But the narrow valley offered few alternatives, and the Marines below didn't have time for elaborate maneuvering. Every minute they delayed increased the likelihood that the insurgents would overrun the position or that the wounded Marines would succumb to their injuries. "Rodriguez, I need you and Jenkins on the door guns. Suppress those positions on the eastern slope during our approach. Can you handle that?" "Yes, ma'am. We'll light them up." The plan was risky, bordering on suicidal by conventional tactical standards. Sarah would have to approach low and fast, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment, then flare hard and fast to land in the small clearing where the Marines waited. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early, and they'd be sitting ducks for every insurgent weapon in the valley. Too late, and they'd crash into the rocky ground with catastrophic results. As Sarah began her approach, she found herself thinking about all the voices that had doubted her capability over the years. The flight instructor who had suggested that women lacked the physical strength for aggressive maneuvering under stress. The fellow pilots who had whispered that she would fold under pressure when lives were on the line. The commanding officers who had been reluctant to assign her to the most dangerous missions. But those voices were drowned out now by the sound of her engines and the urgent calls from the Marines below. This was her moment of truth, not just as a pilot, but as a soldier, as a woman in a profession that had questioned her every step of the way. The Marines on the ground didn't care about her gender or the politics of women in combat roles. They cared about one thing: getting out of that valley alive. "Beginning approach," Sarah announced over the radio, her voice steady and controlled despite the chaos erupting around her aircraft. The Black Hawk dropped like a stone, skimming just meters above the rocky terrain as Sarah used every fold and depression in the landscape to mask their approach. The aircraft shuddered as they hit pockets of turbulence created by the heat rising from the valley floor, but Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls, making minute adjustments to keep them on course. At 500 meters from the landing zone, the first tracer rounds began reaching toward their aircraft. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes from the northern ridge, bright orange sparks that seemed to float lazily through the air before accelerating past their cockpit with deadly intent. The temptation to climb, to gain altitude and distance from the threat was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at her to get away from the incoming fire. But climbing would expose them to the RPG teams, and it would delay their arrival at the LZ where Marines were dying. Sarah pushed the nose forward, accelerating toward the danger rather than away from it, using speed and the element of surprise to minimize their exposure time. "Taking fire from the northern ridge," Rodriguez reported calmly over the intercom. "Multiple automatic weapons." "Copy. Stay on those door guns. Suppress those positions." The M240 machine guns mounted in the aircraft's doors opened up with a thunderous roar, sending streams of 7.62mm rounds toward the insurgent positions. The tracers arced through the air like deadly fireworks, impacting on the rocky ridges and sending up showers of sparks and stone chips. It wasn't precision fire. At this range and speed, suppression was the goal rather than accuracy, but it served its purpose by forcing the insurgents to take cover rather than maintaining aimed fire at the approaching helicopter. At 200 meters from the LZ, an RPG streaked past our aircraft, the rocket-propelled grenade missing our tail rotor by mere feet before detonating against the valley wall behind us. The explosion sent shockwaves through the aircraft, and Sarah felt the controls shudder in her hands as debris pelted their fuselage. "RPG! Close miss!" Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with adrenaline. "They've got our range!" Sarah's training took over, muscle memory and countless hours of practice guiding her actions, even as her conscious mind struggled to process the magnitude of the threat they were facing. She jinked the aircraft, left, then right, presenting an unpredictable target while maintaining her approach to the landing zone. The moves were aggressive, almost violent, as she threw the multi-ton aircraft around the sky with a precision that would have impressed her most skeptical instructors. The Marines' position was now clearly visible ahead, marked by the green smoke that drifted across the rocky clearing. Sarah could see individual soldiers crouched behind cover, some returning fire toward the insurgent positions, others tending to wounded comrades who lay motionless on the ground. The sight of the casualties only reinforced the urgency of their mission. These men needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided at a forward surgical hospital. 50 meters to touchdown, Sarah announced over the radio, beginning her flare to arrest their forward momentum and prepare for landing. It was at this moment that the second RPG team engaged. Their rocket streaked toward the helicopter from the eastern slope. This time, there was no miss. The grenade detonated just 20 meters from our aircraft, the explosion sending shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage and filling the cabin with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal.
The explosion rocked the Black Hawk violently, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah felt the aircraft yaw uncontrollably to the right as shrapnel damaged the tail rotor assembly. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel like a deadly Christmas tree, hydraulic pressure dropping, engine temperature climbing, electrical systems flickering in and out of operation. The aircraft was wounded, bleeding mechanical fluids onto the valley floor, but it was still flying. "We're hit! We're hit!" Rodriguez shouted over the intercom, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Engine 2 is showing damage. Hydraulics are failing." Sarah's hands flew over the controls, adjusting for the asymmetric thrust and the loss of hydraulic assistance that made the aircraft feel like it was fighting her every input. This was the moment that separated good pilots from great ones, the ability to fly a damaged aircraft through enemy fire while maintaining enough control to complete the mission. "How bad?" she asked, her voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. "We can still fly, but barely. We need to get on the ground now, ma'am." The landing zone was less than 50 meters ahead, but it might as well have been 50 miles. Sarah could see the Marines moving toward their intended touchdown point, carrying wounded comrades and providing covering fire against the insurgent positions that continued to rake the area with automatic weapons fire. Staff Sergeant Peterson was waving them in, his arm movements sharp and urgent as he directed his men into position for the extraction. Sarah knew she had one chance to get this right. The damaged aircraft wouldn't tolerate multiple landing attempts, and the insurgents were clearly zeroing in on their position. If she missed the LZ or landed too hard, they would all be stranded in the kill zone, and the Black Hawk would become nothing more than an expensive coffin for everyone aboard. "Jenkins, Rodriguez, I need you to keep those guns working. Suppress everything that moves on those ridges." "Roger that, ma'am. We've got you covered." The M240s continued their deadly chatter, pouring fire onto the insurgent positions with methodical precision. Spent brass cascaded from the aircraft like metallic rain, and the air inside the cabin became thick with cordite smoke and the smell of burning gun oil. Through it all, Sarah maintained her approach, fighting the damaged aircraft every foot of the way toward the Marines below. At 30 meters, another burst of automatic weapons fire stitched across the aircraft's nose, spider-webbing the armored windscreen and sending Sarah ducking instinctively as she maintained control. The temptation to abort the landing was overwhelming. Every rational calculation suggested that continuing the approach was suicide, but the Marines on the ground didn't have the luxury of a second chance, and Sarah wasn't about to abandon them to save her own aircraft. 20 meters to touchdown, she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The insurgents seemed to sense that this was their last chance to bring down the American helicopter. Fire intensified from all directions, tracer rounds crisscrossing the valley like deadly spiderwebs. An RPG detonated against the ridge above them, showering the aircraft with rock and debris that hammered against the fuselage like deadly hail. Through it all, Sarah maintained her descent, using every ounce of skill and training to keep the wounded aircraft under control. The ground rushed up to meet them, rocky and unforgiving, offering no margin for error. At the last second, she flared hard, trading forward momentum for a controlled descent that brought them down with a jarring impact that rattled every bolt and rivet in the airframe. "We're down! We're down!" Rodriguez shouted over the intercom, and immediately the crew was in motion. The Marines needed no encouragement. Peterson's team moved with the precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this drill countless times, carrying their wounded comrades toward the aircraft while maintaining suppressive fire against the insurgent positions. The urgency in their movements spoke to the desperate nature of their situation. They all knew that the longer the helicopter remained on the ground, the more likely it was that enemy fire would find its mark. Sarah kept the engines running, even as warning lights continued to flash across her instrument panel. The aircraft was dying around her, hydraulic fluid and engine oil seeping onto the valley floor, but she needed to keep it operational for just a few more minutes, just long enough to get the Marines aboard and clear the kill zone. "Load 'em up!" Rodriguez shouted to the Marines, and the cabin became a scene of controlled chaos as wounded soldiers were carried aboard. The first casualty was a young Marine who couldn't have been older than 19, his leg mangled by shrapnel and his face pale from blood loss. As the medic worked to stabilize him, Sarah could hear him calling for his mother, his voice weak but audible over the sound of the engines. It was a sound that cut through all the tactical considerations and political debates about women in combat. This was simply a young American who needed to get home. The second casualty was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored as Peterson and another Marine lifted him into the aircraft. Rodriguez immediately began working on him, applying pressure bandages and checking vital signs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen too much combat. "We've got 3 more coming," Peterson shouted over the noise, and Sarah could see him directing his remaining able-bodied Marines toward the aircraft while maintaining security on the perimeter. But the insurgents weren't finished. As the loading continued, incoming fire intensified, and Sarah could hear rounds impacting the aircraft's fuselage with metallic pings that spoke to just how close they were cutting this extraction. One round punched through the cabin wall just inches from where Rodriguez was working on a casualty, but the experienced crew chief didn't even flinch as he continued his life-saving work. "Ma'am, we need to go," Rodriguez called out, his voice urgent. "This bird won't take much more punishment." Sarah looked back at the loading operation, calculating time and risk with the cold precision that her training had ingrained in her. 6 Marines were already aboard, with 2 more being carried toward the aircraft. That left Peterson and 1 other Marine to provide security for the withdrawal, and Sarah wasn't leaving without all of them. 30 more seconds, she called back, knowing that every second increased their vulnerability, but unwilling to abandon men who had risked everything to reach her aircraft. It was then that the mortar rounds began falling. The first one detonated 50 meters away, close enough to shower the aircraft with dirt and debris, but not close enough to cause serious damage. But Sarah knew that mortars worked like artillery. The first round was for ranging, and the follow-up shots would be increasingly accurate. "Mortars! Mortars!" Peterson shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the engines. "We need to move now!" The last 2 wounded Marines were pushed aboard just as the second mortar round detonated, this one close enough to rock the aircraft and send shrapnel pinging off the rotor blades. Peterson dove through the cabin door, followed immediately by his remaining Marine, and Rodriguez was already moving to secure the doors. "Go! Go! Go!" Peterson shouted, and Sarah didn't need any further encouragement.
Sarah pulled power and lifted off from the rocky valley floor, just as the third mortar round detonated exactly where they had been sitting moments before. The explosion sent a shockwave through the aircraft that rattled her teeth and filled the cabin with dust and debris. But they were airborne and climbing away from the kill zone. For the first time in what felt like hours, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of relief. They had gotten the Marines out alive. But their ordeal was far from over. The damaged Black Hawk was barely flyable, with hydraulic systems failing and engine temperature gauges climbing toward the red line. Sarah could feel the aircraft fighting her inputs, the controls becoming increasingly heavy and unresponsive as system after system either failed or degraded. What should have been a routine 15-minute flight back to base had become a desperate struggle to keep the aircraft in the air long enough to reach medical facilities. "Rodriguez, what's our status back there?" Sarah called over the intercom, her attention divided between flying the crippled aircraft and monitoring the welfare of the wounded Marines in the cabin. "We've got 3 urgent surgical, ma'am. The kid with the leg wound is going into shock, and the unconscious Marine is barely breathing. We need to get to a trauma hospital fast." Sarah's jaw tightened as she processed the information. The nearest forward surgical team was at Forward Operating Base Chapman, still 12 minutes away at their current speed. But the damaged aircraft was losing altitude steadily, and Sarah wasn't certain they could maintain flight that long. The alternative was an emergency landing in hostile territory, a death sentence for everyone aboard. "Can you keep them stable for 12 minutes? "I'll do everything I can, ma'am, but they need real doctors. These boys are in bad shape." Through the smoke and chaos of the cabin, Sarah could hear the wounded Marines, some conscious and aware of their situation, others lost in the fog of pain and blood loss that accompanied severe trauma. One young Marine kept asking for his girlfriend, wanting someone to call her and tell her he was okay. Another was reciting what sounded like a prayer, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. These weren't statistics or tactical considerations anymore. They were real people with families and dreams and futures that hung in the balance. Sarah had trained for situations like this, but no amount of simulation could prepare her for the weight of responsibility that came with 8 lives depending entirely on her ability to fly a dying aircraft through hostile territory.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As they climbed away from the valley, Sarah's mind flashed back to her childhood in Nebraska and a conversation she'd had with her grandfather shortly before he passed away. He had been a bomber pilot in World War II, flying B-24 Liberators over Europe in missions that claimed the lives of too many young airmen. Sarah remembered asking him what it felt like to be responsible for the lives of his crew members, and his response had stayed with her through all the years of training and doubt. Sarah, he had said, his weathered hands folded in his lap as they sat on the porch of his farmhouse. There comes a moment in every pilot's life when you realize that flying isn't about you anymore. It's about the people counting on you to get them home. When that moment comes, you'll discover reserves of strength and skill that you never knew you possessed. Now, fighting to keep the damaged Black Hawk in the air while wounded Marines bled in the cabin behind her, Sarah understood exactly what her grandfather had meant. This wasn't about proving herself to skeptical instructors or silencing critics who doubted women's capability in combat roles. This was about 8 Americans who needed to get home, and she was their only hope. The aircraft shuddered as they hit another pocket of turbulence, and Sarah noticed that the engine temperature on the damaged power plant was climbing dangerously high. Red warning lights bathed the cockpit in an ominous glow, and she could smell the acrid scent of burning electrical insulation. The Black Hawk was living on borrowed time, each minute in the air a small miracle that pushed their luck further toward the breaking point. "Ma'am, Engine 2 is overheating badly," Rodriguez called from the cabin, where he had moved to monitor the aircraft's systems while continuing to provide medical care to the wounded Marines. "We're going to lose it soon." Sarah nodded grimly, her mind already calculating the performance limitations of single-engine flight in their current condition. A Black Hawk could fly on one engine under ideal circumstances, but they were loaded with casualties, damaged by enemy fire, and operating at altitude in thin mountain air. If they lost the second engine, they would auto-rotate to the ground, a controlled crash that might be survivable under perfect conditions, but would likely prove fatal for the severely wounded Marines in the cabin. "How much longer to Chapman?" she asked, knowing the answer but hoping that somehow time had compressed in their favor. 8 minutes, ma'am. Maybe 7 if we push it." Sarah pushed the collective down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed in an attempt to reach the base before the dying engine finally gave up. It was a calculated risk. Flying lower made them more vulnerable to small arms fire from the ground, but it also reduced the strain on the damaged power plant and gave them a better chance of maintaining flight. Behind her, she could hear Rodriguez working frantically to keep the wounded Marines alive. His voice was calm and professional as he talked them through their injuries, explaining procedures and offering reassurance as he worked to stop bleeding and maintain airways. It was a masterclass in battlefield medicine, performed under the worst possible conditions by a soldier who refused to give up on his patients. "Talk to me, Rodriguez. How are they doing?" "The leg wound is stabilized for now, but he's lost a lot of blood. The head injury is touch and go. He needs immediate surgery. The others are stable but in significant pain." Sarah tried not to think about what would happen if they didn't reach medical facilities in time. These Marines had survived the firefight in the valley, had made it through the extraction under heavy enemy fire, and had trusted her to get them to safety. The thought of losing any of them now, so close to help, was almost unbearable. The landscape below began to look familiar as they approached the area around FOB Chapman. Sarah could see the distinctive features that marked friendly territory. The geometric patterns of defensive positions, the carefully maintained helicopter landing zones, the controlled access roads that snaked between security checkpoints. After the chaos and danger of the valley, the sight of the forward operating base felt like glimpsing paradise. "Chapman Tower, this is Phoenix requesting immediate medical emergency landing," Sarah transmitted on the tower frequency, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of a pilot dealing with a serious situation. "Phoenix, Chapman Tower, roger your emergency. What's your status?"
Phoenix Chapman Tower is a damaged Black Hawk with 8 souls on board, including 3 urgent surgical casualties. Request immediate priority landing and medical team standing by. Roger, Phoenix, you're cleared for immediate approach to LZ Delta. Medical team is being scrambled now. What's the nature of your aircraft damage? Sarah hesitated for a moment, not wanting to alarm the tower controllers, but needing them to understand the severity of their situation. A damaged aircraft with wounded personnel on board was every air traffic controller's nightmare. Too many variables, too many things that could go wrong in the final moments of flight. Phoenix, Chapman Tower understands. Emergency vehicles are rolling now. You're cleared for any approach you need to make. We've got you covered. As the forward operating base grew larger in her windscreen, Sarah felt the second engine begin to miss and surge, its damaged components finally beginning to fail under the strain of continued operation. The aircraft yawed slightly as power fluctuated, and she had to work harder to maintain heading and altitude as the flight characteristics degraded further. "Engine 2 is failing," Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with concern. "We're losing power." Sarah's hands moved instinctively over the controls, adjusting for the power loss and preparing for the possibility of complete engine failure during the final approach. Single-engine approaches were challenging under the best of circumstances, but attempting one with a damaged aircraft full of casualties while operating at the edge of performance envelopes was an exercise in controlled desperation. The landing zone at FOB Chapman appeared ahead, marked by the distinctive orange panels that identified helicopter landing areas. Sarah could see emergency vehicles already positioned around the LZ, ambulances, fire trucks, and medical personnel standing by to provide immediate assistance to the wounded Marines. The sight of that preparation, the knowledge that help was waiting just a few hundred meters away, gave her the final burst of determination she needed to complete the mission.
Beginning final approach, Sarah announced over the radio, her voice steady despite the fact that Engine 2 had just seized completely, leaving her with only one functioning power plant and rapidly degrading flight controls. The approach to LZ Delta required a steep descent over the base's defensive perimeter, a maneuver that would normally be routine but had become treacherous given their aircraft's condition. Sarah could feel the Black Hawk's limitations with every control input. Responses that should have been immediate and precise now lagged and felt mushy, requiring constant corrections to maintain the desired flight path. "Single-engine approach," she announced to the tower, the words carrying weight that every pilot and controller understood. Single-engine approaches were emergency procedures that required perfect execution and offered little margin for error. Too steep, and they would overshoot the landing zone. Too shallow, and they might not make it to the LZ at all. In the cabin behind her, Rodriguez continued his life-saving work while simultaneously serving as Sarah's eyes and ears for aircraft systems that she couldn't monitor from the cockpit. His voice provided a steady stream of updates on the condition of both the wounded Marines and the dying aircraft, information that Sarah used to make split-second decisions about power management and flight path. "Ma'am, the kid with the leg wound just went unconscious," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a medical professional dealing with a critical patient. "His blood pressure's dropping fast. We need to get on the ground now." Sarah nodded grimly, pushing the nose forward slightly to increase their descent rate, even though it meant accepting a steeper approach angle that pushed the aircraft's performance envelope further toward the edge. Every decision now carried life or death consequences. Too conservative, and they might arrive too late to save the wounded Marines. Too aggressive, and they might crash short of the landing zone. The defensive perimeter of FOB Chapman passed beneath them, marked by concrete barriers and guard towers that had been designed to protect the base from ground attack. Sarah could see soldiers on the walls watching their approach, some with weapons ready in case the damaged aircraft posed a threat, others simply observing what they recognized as a pilot fighting to save lives. At 300 meters from the LZ, the remaining engine began to surge and fluctuate, its temperature gauges now solidly in the red zone, as damaged components finally succumbed to the stress of emergency operation.
Sarah could feel the power variations through the flight controls, requiring constant adjustments to maintain their approach path as the engine delivered inconsistent power. "Engine 1 is going critical," Rodriguez called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the struggling power plant. "Oil pressure is dropping fast." Sarah's training took over completely now, muscle memory and thousands of hours of practice guiding her actions even as her conscious mind struggled to process the magnitude of the emergency they faced. Auto-rotation procedures flashed in her memory, the technique for landing a helicopter after complete engine failure, using stored energy in the rotor system to cushion the final touchdown. But auto-rotation required altitude and airspeed to be successful, and Sarah wasn't sure they had enough of either given their current situation. They were committed to the approach now, too low to abort and climb away, too close to the base to attempt an emergency landing elsewhere. This would be their only chance. "Hold on back there," Sarah called over the intercom, her voice carrying the controlled tension of a pilot preparing for the most challenging landing of her career. "This is going to be rough." The engine finally seized completely just as they crossed the boundary of the landing zone, leaving them with nothing but gravity and the stored energy in the rotor blades to cushion their descent. Sarah immediately lowered the collective pitch, reducing the drag on the rotor system to maintain rotor RPM as long as possible, while simultaneously pulling back on the cyclic to flare the aircraft and trade forward airspeed for a reduction in descent rate. It was a delicate balance that required perfect timing and precise control inputs. Too much flare too early, and they would run out of energy before reaching the ground. Too little flare, and they might not make it to the LZ at all. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, making minute adjustments based on the feel of the aircraft and the visual cues provided by the approaching ground. The medical personnel around the landing zone had recognized what was happening and were taking cover behind vehicles and concrete barriers, knowing that auto-rotation landings could go wrong quickly and violently. But they remained ready to rush forward the moment the aircraft came to rest, medical bags and stretchers in hand, prepared to continue the fight to save the wounded Marines. At 50 feet above the ground, Sarah began her final flare, pulling back aggressively on the cyclic to arrest their forward motion and descent rate. The aircraft shuddered and groaned under the stress, damaged components protesting against the demands being placed on the airframe. But the maneuver was working. Their descent rate was decreasing, their forward speed bleeding off, as the aircraft transitioned from flight to a controlled crash. At 20 feet, Sarah pulled in the last of the collective pitch, using the final stored energy in the rotor system to cushion their touchdown. The Black Hawk hit the landing zone hard. Harder than any normal landing, but not hard enough to cause catastrophic damage. The aircraft bounced once, settled back onto its landing gear with a grinding crash of stressed metal, and finally came to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. We're down, Rodriguez shouted, and immediately the LZ erupted in controlled chaos as medical personnel rushed toward the aircraft. Sarah's hands were shaking as she went through the emergency shutdown procedures, cutting fuel and electrical systems to prevent fire, while her mind slowly processed the fact that they had made it. All 8 Marines were alive, the aircraft had held together long enough to complete the mission, and the wounded would receive the medical care they desperately needed. The cabin doors were yanked open by medical personnel, who immediately began triaging the wounded Marines with professional efficiency. Sarah could hear Rodriguez briefing the doctors on each casualty's condition, providing vital information about treatments administered during flight and current status of injuries. The young Marine with the leg wound just went onto a stretcher, medical personnel working frantically to stabilize his blood pressure as they rushed him toward the waiting ambulance. "Nice flying, ma'am. That was some of the finest piloting I have ever seen," Rodriguez said as he helped transfer the last casualty to the medical team. Sarah nodded numbly, still processing the events of the last hour. She climbed out of the cockpit on unsteady legs, her flight suit soaked with sweat, and her hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency. Around the landing zone, soldiers and medical personnel continued their work with practiced efficiency, but several stopped to nod respectfully in her direction, acknowledgement from professionals who understood exactly what she had just accomplished. Staff Sergeant Peterson approached her as the last of his Marines were loaded into ambulances, his face streaked with dirt and cordite, but his eyes clear and focused. The grizzled Marine NCO stopped in front of Sarah and came to attention, rendering a crisp salute that spoke volumes about his respect for what she had done. "Ma'am, on behalf of my Marines, thank you," Pedersen said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved 8 lives today, and we won't forget what you did for us." Sarah returned the salute, her throat tight with emotion as she watched the ambulances racing toward the base hospital. "Just doing my job, Sergeant. I'm glad we got everyone out." "No, ma'am. With respect, that wasn't just doing your job. That was heroism under fire. You flew into hell to get us out, and you brought us home when that bird should have crashed in the valley. My Marines are alive because you had the courage to do what needed to be done." As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah found herself thinking about all the voices that had doubted her over the years. The instructors who had questioned whether women could handle combat stress, the fellow pilots who had whispered about emotional instability and physical limitations, the commanding officers who had been reluctant to assign her to the most dangerous missions. She wondered what they would think now, seeing 8 Marines alive because she had chosen to fly into an active firefight, when a more cautious approach might have meant arriving too late. But more than vindication, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The knowledge that she had found her place in a profession that had initially seemed determined to exclude her. She wasn't a female pilot trying to prove she belonged. She was simply a pilot who had done her job under impossible circumstances and brought her people home.
The investigation into the mission began within hours of Sarah's emergency landing at FOB Chapman, as military officials attempted to piece together the events that had led to one of the most daring helicopter rescues of the Afghan conflict. Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of being simultaneously praised for her heroism and questioned about her decision-making during critical moments of the mission. Colonel Richards, the same officer who had initially dispatched her to the rescue, sat across from Sarah in a sterile debriefing room, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the preliminary reports from the mission. Behind him sat Major General Patricia Williams, a career aviator who had fought her own battles to rise through the ranks of a male-dominated profession, and whose presence suggested that this debriefing carried implications far beyond a simple mission review. "Captain Martinez," Colonel Richards began, his tone formal and measured. "Let's start with your decision to continue the approach after taking RPG damage. Standard protocol would have been to abort and request backup. What was your reasoning for continuing the mission?" Sarah had known this question was coming, had rehearsed her answer during the sleepless hours following the mission, but found herself thinking carefully about how to articulate the complex calculations that had driven her actions in those critical moments. "Sir, aborting the approach would have left 8 Marines in an untenable position," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "They had multiple casualties requiring immediate medical attention, they were running low on ammunition, and enemy forces were closing their position. There was no backup available in the time frame required, and delaying extraction would have resulted in additional casualties or complete loss of the unit. But you knowingly flew a damaged aircraft into an active firefight," Major General Williams interjected, her tone neutral but probing. "That decision placed not only your crew at risk, but also potentially compromised your ability to extract the Marines if the aircraft had suffered catastrophic failure." She nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation she was being asked to defend. Military decision-making always involved calculated risks, but the line between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment was often blurred in combat situations. "Ma'am, I assessed the aircraft damage and determined that we remained mission-capable for the time required to complete the extraction. The alternative was to leave Marines in a kill zone where they would likely have been overrun or bled out from their injuries. In my judgment, the risk to the aircraft and crew was justified by the certainty of casualties on the ground." Colonel Richards made notes on his tablet before looking up again. "Your crew chief reported that you executed single-engine approaches and auto-rotation procedures under extreme conditions. How do you assess your performance during those critical phases of flight?" This was dangerous territory, Sarah realized. Too much confidence might be interpreted as reckless bravado, while too much modesty might suggest that luck rather than skill had carried them through the emergency. She chose her words carefully, trying to convey professional competence without appearing arrogant. Sir, the emergency procedures were executed according to training and established protocols. The aircraft performed within acceptable parameters given the damage sustained, and the crew coordination was exemplary throughout the emergency. We were fortunate that the aircraft held together long enough to reach medical facilities. Major General Williams leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. Captain, there's been considerable discussion about this mission at higher headquarters. Some have suggested that your actions represent exactly the kind of heroism under fire that validates women's roles in combat aviation. Others have argued that the risks you accepted were beyond acceptable parameters and that a more experienced pilot might have found alternative solutions. How do you respond to that? Sarah felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the burden of representing not just herself, but all women who might follow in her path. Every decision she had made, every risk she had accepted, would be scrutinized not just for its tactical merit, but for what it suggested about women's capability in combat roles. Ma'am, I don't believe gender was a factor in my decision-making process. I evaluated the tactical situation, assessed available options, and chose the course of action that offered the best chance of mission success with acceptable risk. Any qualified pilot faced with the same circumstances would have made similar decisions. But would they? Colonel Richards asked pointedly. Your flight instructor from advanced training submitted a report suggesting that female pilots might be more likely to accept excessive risks due to pressure to prove themselves in combat situations. He argues that your actions, while ultimately successful, demonstrated exactly that kind of dangerous overcompensation. Sarah felt a flash of anger, but kept her expression neutral. Major Thompson's opinions about women in combat aviation were well known, and she wasn't surprised that he had used this mission as an opportunity to advance his personal theories about gender and risk assessment. Sir, with respect, I believe my actions were driven by tactical necessities rather than any desire to prove myself. The Marines on the ground required immediate extraction, and I had the training and equipment necessary to provide that support. The risks were carefully calculated and deemed acceptable given the consequences of inaction. Major General Williams nodded slowly, her expression suggesting that she had heard these debates before and understood the broader implications of the discussion. Captain Martinez, regardless of the political ramifications of this mission, the fact remains that you extracted 8 Marines from an active combat zone under extremely dangerous conditions, and you did so with minimal casualties despite significant aircraft damage. From a purely operational standpoint, that represents exceptional airmanship and devotion to duty. Thank you, ma'am. However, the general continued, your actions will be studied closely by people making policy decisions about women in combat roles. Your success validates the position that female aviators can perform effectively under extreme stress, but critics will argue that you took unnecessary risks that could have resulted in catastrophic failure. You need to understand that burden. Sarah nodded, understanding perfectly the weight that came with being among the first women to prove themselves in direct combat roles. Every mission, every decision, every outcome would be analyzed not just for its individual merit, but for what it suggested about the capabilities and limitations of women in warfare. I understand, ma'am. I accept that responsibility. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering technical aspects of the mission, aircraft performance under battle damage, and crew coordination during emergency procedures. Through it all, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor while internally processing the broader implications of what had occurred in that Afghan valley. When the session finally concluded, Major General Williams asked Sarah to remain behind for a private conversation. After Colonel Richards departed, the general's formal demeanor relaxed slightly, revealing the person behind the rank insignia. Captain, I want you to understand something, Williams began, her voice taking on a more personal tone. 20 years ago, I was the first woman to command a combat aviation unit. Every decision I made was scrutinized, every mistake was magnified, and every success was minimized by people who believed women didn't belong in combat aviation. Sarah listened intently, recognizing the opportunity to learn from someone who had faced similar challenges. The mission you flew yesterday was extraordinary by any standard. You demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and judgment under conditions that would challenge the most experienced combat pilots. But you're going to discover that excellence isn't enough.
You have to be perfect, because any failure will be attributed to your gender rather than normal human limitations. Ma'am, how do you handle that pressure? Williams smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had found ways to thrive despite institutional skepticism. You remember why you're here. You're not flying to prove that women belong in combat aviation. You're flying to bring Americans home. Focus on the mission, execute to the best of your ability, and let your performance speak for itself. The politics will take care of themselves. As Sarah left the debriefing room, she found herself thinking about the young Marine with the leg wound, wondering how he was recovering and whether he would be able to return to duty. She thought about Staff Sergeant Peterson and his remaining Marines, who would soon be back in the field facing new dangers. Most of all, she thought about the simple fact that 8 Americans were alive because she had chosen to do her job regardless of the political implications or personal costs. Walking across the base toward her quarters, she passed groups of soldiers going about their daily routines, some heading to training exercises, others returning from patrols, all of them part of the complex machinery of modern warfare. A few nodded respectfully as she passed, word of the previous day's mission having spread through the close-knit aviation community with the speed that characterized military gossip. But Sarah barely noticed the attention. Her mind already focused on the next mission, the next group of Americans who might need someone willing to fly into danger to bring them home. The debates about women in combat would continue in conference rooms and policy meetings far from the battlefield. But out here, where bullets flew and people bled, there was only one question that mattered. Could you do the job when lives depended on it? Sarah had answered that question definitively, not just for herself, but for every woman who would follow in her path. The rest was just politics.
3 weeks after the Valley extraction, Sarah found herself back in the cockpit of a Black Hawk, this time leading a formation of 4 aircraft on a complex mission deep into Taliban-controlled territory. The success of her previous rescue had earned her rapid promotion to flight lead status, but it had also placed her under an intense microscope as military leadership evaluated whether her heroics represented sustainable performance or a dangerous anomaly. The mission briefing had been sobering. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for orchestrating attacks against American forces, was meeting with his lieutenants in a remote compound near the Pakistani border. Special operations forces needed immediate insertion and extraction support, and the mission required the kind of precision flying and tactical coordination that separated elite aviation units from conventional transport squadrons. Sarah studied the tactical display in her cockpit, noting the positions of her wingmen as they approached the target area in tight formation. Behind her, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been reassigned to her crew permanently, a recognition of the exceptional teamwork they had demonstrated during the emergency extraction. In the cabin, a team of Army Rangers sat in focused silence, their equipment and weapons checked and rechecked as they prepared for what promised to be a dangerous ground operation. "Phoenix Flight, this is Overwatch," came the voice of the mission commander through her headset. "Target compound is 2 clicks ahead. Intelligence reports minimal security, but expect that to change rapidly once boots hit the ground." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while mentally reviewing the complex choreography required for the mission. Her aircraft would insert the Rangers at a landing zone approximately 1 kilometer from the target compound, while the other 3 Black Hawks provided security overwatch and prepared for immediate extraction once the ground mission was complete. The entire operation was designed to last no more than 30 minutes. Get in fast, complete the mission, and withdraw before enemy reinforcements could arrive. But as they approached the insertion point, Sarah's tactical instincts began triggering warning signals. The valley floor was too quiet, too empty of the normal signs of civilian activity that characterized rural Afghan settlements. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, recounting stories of bomber missions over Germany, where experienced crews learned to recognize the subtle signs that suggested an ambush waiting below. "Rodriguez, does this area feel right to you?" Sarah asked over the intercom, trusting the veteran crew chief's combat experience to validate her growing unease. "Negative, ma'am. It's too quiet down there. I don't like it." Sarah made a rapid decision that went against the established mission plan. Instead of proceeding directly to the designated landing zone, she banked her aircraft to the left and began a reconnaissance pass over the surrounding terrain, using her aircraft's thermal imaging systems to scan for signs of enemy activity. Phoenix Lead, this is Overwatch. You're deviating from planned approach. What's your status? Overwatch, Phoenix Lead is conducting tactical reconnaissance. Something doesn't feel right about this, LZ. It was exactly the kind of deviation from established procedures that critics would seize upon if things went wrong, evidence that female pilots were prone to emotional decision-making and unreliable adherence to mission parameters. But Sarah's instincts, honed by months of combat operations and validated by the successful Valley extraction, were screaming warnings that she couldn't ignore. The thermal imaging confirmed her suspicions. Hidden among the rocks and vegetation surrounding the landing zone were heat signatures that suggested human presence. Too many signatures positioned too strategically to represent normal civilian activity. The Rangers were being led into a carefully prepared ambush that would have decimated the team within minutes of insertion. Overwatch, Phoenix Lead has multiple personnel and concealed positions around the primary LZ. Recommend abort and move to alternate insertion point. There was a brief pause before the mission commander responded, and I could imagine the rapid calculations taking place in the command center as intelligence was reassessed and tactical options were evaluated. Phoenix Lead, Overwatch confirms your assessment. Proceed to LZ Bravo for insertion. The alternate landing zone was 3 kilometers away from the target compound, requiring the Rangers to cover significantly more ground on foot, and potentially compromising the element of surprise that was critical to mission success. But it was better than inserting directly into an ambush that would have resulted in catastrophic casualties. As the formation turned toward the alternate LZ, Sarah found herself thinking about the fine line between tactical prudence and operational timidity. Critics of women in combat roles often argued that female decision-makers were overly cautious, prone to avoiding necessary risks in favor of safer alternatives that might compromise mission objectives. But Sarah's modification to the mission plan had potentially saved the lives of an entire Ranger team, a result that validated aggressive reconnaissance over blind adherence to predetermined plans. LZ Bravo proved to be clear of enemy activity, and the Rangers deployed rapidly from Sarah's aircraft with the practiced efficiency that characterized special operations units. As the soldiers disappeared into the rocky terrain, Sarah's aircraft climbed away from the landing zone and took up an overwatch position that would allow rapid response if the ground team required immediate support. Phoenix Lead, this is Ranger 6, came the voice of the Ranger team leader over the radio. Good call on the LZ change. We're moving toward objective now. For the next 25 minutes, Sarah orbited the target area while monitoring radio traffic from the ground team. The Rangers encountered minimal resistance as they approached the compound, confirming intelligence reports about light security around the target. But Sarah's attention remained focused on the original landing zone, where thermal imaging continued to show enemy personnel in concealed positions. The Taliban fighters were clearly waiting for an American insertion that would never come, their ambush carefully planned, but ultimately wasted due to Sarah's decision to deviate from the established mission plan. It was a tactical victory that would likely go unreported in official mission summaries, but one that demonstrated the value of experienced judgment over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Phoenix Lead, this is Ranger 6. Package secured. Requesting immediate extraction from LZ Charlie. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and coordinated with her wingman for the extraction phase of the mission. LZ Charlie was a rocky clearing approximately 2 kilometers from the target compound, selected as the extraction point specifically because it offered multiple approach and departure routes that would confuse enemy attempts to predict American movements. As the formation descended toward the extraction point, Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from various positions around the target compound. The Rangers had successfully completed their mission, but enemy reinforcements were arriving and beginning to organize pursuit operations. Time was becoming critical. Every minute they remained in the area increased the likelihood of encountering organized resistance or sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. The extraction went smoothly, with Rangers loading rapidly into the waiting aircraft, while security elements provided overwatch against potential threats. Sarah's aircraft lifted off with a high-value target secured in the cabin, flanked by rangers who maintained careful watch over their prisoner while medics treated minor wounds sustained during the ground operation. Phoenix Flight, this is Overwatch. Outstanding mission execution. RTB when ready. As the formation climbed away from the target area and began the flight back to base, Sarah reflected on the subtle but important ways that her approach to combat operations had evolved since the Valley extraction 3 weeks earlier. The earlier mission had been about raw courage and technical skill under extreme pressure. The ability to fly a damaged aircraft through enemy fire when there were no other alternatives available. This mission had required a different kind of leadership, the confidence to modify established plans based on tactical intuition, the ability to make rapid decisions that affected not just her own crew, but an entire special operations team. It was the kind of judgment that came from experience and could only be developed through exposure to real combat situations where the consequences of poor decisions were measured in American lives. But Sarah also understood that her decision to deviate from the planned approach would be scrutinized by people looking for evidence to support preconceived notions about women in combat roles. If the mission had failed, critics would have blamed her emotional decision-making and reluctance to accept necessary risks. Because it succeeded, they would likely argue that any competent pilot would have made the same choices, and that gender remained irrelevant to the discussion. The political dimensions of her service were becoming increasingly complex as her reputation grew within the special operations community. Sarah found herself walking a tightrope between demonstrating exceptional competence and avoiding the kind of high-profile attention that might politicize her service and affect other women seeking similar opportunities.
The medal ceremony took place on a crisp morning at Bagram Airfield, with Sarah standing at attention before a gathering of senior officers, fellow aviators, and support personnel who had assembled to witness the recognition of exceptional service under combat conditions. The Distinguished Flying Cross hung heavy in the presenter's hands, a decoration that represented not just individual heroism, but validation of capabilities that had been questioned and debated for decades. General Robert Mackenzie, the theater commander, stood before Sarah with the kind of presence that came from 30 years of military service and multiple combat deployments. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in places where the stakes were measured in American lives, and his presence at the ceremony spoke to the significance that military leadership placed on Sarah's achievements. "Captain Martinez," General Mackenzie began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "The Distinguished Flying Cross is awarded for heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Your actions during the extraction of Marines from hostile territory under extreme combat conditions exemplify the finest traditions of military aviation and reflect great credit upon yourself, your unit, and the United States Army." As the general pinned the medal to Sarah's dress uniform, she found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. From the doubting voices in high school, to the skeptical flight instructors, from the whispered conversations about women's limitations, to the politicians debating gender roles in combat, all of it had led to this recognition of what she had accomplished, not as a female pilot, but simply as a pilot who had done her job under impossible circumstances. The citation was read aloud to the assembled crowd, detailing the specifics of the Valley extraction mission in language that conveyed both the technical complexity and life-threatening nature of the operation. As the words echoed across the ceremony area, Sarah could see nods of recognition from fellow aviators who understood exactly what kind of flying had been required to complete that mission successfully. But even as she accepted the honor, Sarah was acutely aware of the broader implications of the ceremony. Every photograph taken, every news report filed, every social media post shared would be analyzed through the lens of the ongoing debate about women in combat roles. Her individual achievement would inevitably become a symbol in arguments that extended far beyond her personal service. After the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and fellow service members offering congratulations. Among them was Colonel Jennifer Hayes, a career intelligence officer who had fought her own battles for recognition in a male-dominated profession and whose presence suggested the kind of mentorship network that was quietly developing among women in senior military positions. "Captain, congratulations on a well-deserved recognition," Colonel Hayes said, her handshake firm and her expression genuinely pleased. "But I hope you understand that this medal represents more than individual achievement. It's validation for every woman who dreams of serving in combat roles." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of expectation that came with being among the first to succeed in previously exclusive roles. "Ma'am, I just did my job. I hope people can see it that way." They will, eventually. But in the meantime, you need to understand that you're carrying the hopes and dreams of a lot of young women who want to serve their country in the same way you have. That's a heavy burden, but it's also an incredible opportunity to inspire the next generation. As the informal reception continued, Sarah was approached by a young female lieutenant who had recently graduated from flight school and was preparing for her first deployment to Afghanistan. Lieutenant Thompson looked exactly as Sarah had years earlier, eager, nervous, and carrying the weight of proving herself in a profession that continued to question women's capabilities. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you," Lieutenant Thompson said, her voice carrying the earnest intensity of someone on the threshold of combat service. "Seeing what you've accomplished gives me confidence that I can succeed out here too." Sarah smiled, remembering her own early days and the hunger for role models who could demonstrate that success was possible despite institutional skepticism. "Lieutenant, the most important thing is to focus on being the best pilot you can be. Master your aircraft, trust your training, and always remember that your job is to bring Americans home safely. Everything else is just noise." "Yes, ma'am. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. How do you handle the pressure of knowing that every mistake you make will be seen as evidence that women can't handle combat operations?" It was a question that went to the heart of Sarah's experience, the constant awareness that her performance was being evaluated not just on its individual merits, but as representative of an entire gender's capabilities. Sarah considered her response carefully, wanting to provide honest guidance without discouraging the young officer. "You handle it by being so good at your job that mistakes become irrelevant. You study harder, train longer, and prepare more thoroughly than anyone expects. You become the pilot that other pilots call when missions are too dangerous for normal crews. You earn respect through performance, not politics. But doesn't that mean we have to be perfect while men are allowed to be human?" Sarah nodded, acknowledging the fundamental unfairness of the situation while recognizing its reality. "Yes, it does. At least for now. But every mission we complete successfully, every crisis we handle professionally, every life we save makes it easier for the women who come after us. We're not just flying for ourselves. We're flying for every woman who wants to serve in combat roles." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been promoted and decorated for his own actions during the Valley extraction. The veteran crew chief approached with a broad smile and the easy familiarity of someone who had shared life-threatening experiences with Sarah. "Ma'am, congratulations on the DFC. Well deserved." "Thank you, Rodriguez. And congratulations on your Bronze Star. You earned it." "We both did, ma'am. That was a team effort from start to finish." As the reception began to wind down, Sarah found herself in conversation with Captain James Morrison, a male pilot from her original flight school class who had followed a more conventional career path through transport and logistics missions. Morrison's presence at the ceremony was significant. Recognition from peers was often more meaningful than official decorations, especially in a community where professional competence was measured by the willingness of others to fly with you in dangerous situations. "Sarah, I have to admit something," Morrison said, his expression serious. "When we were in flight school, I didn't think women belonged in combat aviation. I thought it was political correctness gone too far, compromising mission effectiveness for social engineering." Sarah listened without responding, recognizing the courage it took for Morrison to acknowledge his previous attitudes publicly. "But watching what you've accomplished out here, seeing how you handle pressure and make decisions under fire, you've changed my mind completely. You're not a female pilot trying to prove herself. You're just a damn good pilot who happens to be female." "Thank you, James. That means a lot coming from you." The thing is, I've been talking to other guys in the squadron, and we're all coming to the same conclusion. Gender doesn't matter when bullets are flying and people need help. What matters is whether you can do the job, and you've proven that beyond any doubt. As Sarah finally returned to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the day's events and their broader significance. The medal ceremony had been gratifying personal recognition, but the conversations with fellow service members suggested something more important, a gradual shift in attitudes that might eventually make gender irrelevant in discussions about combat effectiveness. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her parents back in Nebraska, a photo of her father holding a newspaper featuring a story about her medal ceremony. The headline read, "Local Girl Becomes Combat Hero," and Sarah winced slightly at the gendered framing, even as she appreciated her family's pride and her achievements. But beneath the newspaper was a letter from a high school student in their hometown, a young woman who had seen the news coverage and wanted to learn about opportunities for women in military aviation. The letter was filled with questions about flight training, physical requirements, and career prospects, the same questions Sarah had asked years earlier when she was first considering military service. Reading the letter, Sarah realized that Colonel Hayes had been right about the broader implications of her service. Whether she wanted it or not, she had become a symbol and role model for young women who saw in her achievements proof that barriers could be broken and limitations overcome. It was a responsibility she had never sought, but could no longer avoid. The next morning brought new mission briefings and the return to operational routines that defined life at a forward operating base. Sarah reviewed intelligence reports and aircraft maintenance logs with the same attention to detail that had characterized her approach to military service from the beginning. But now there was an additional dimension to her work, the knowledge that every mission she flew successfully made it easier for the women who would follow in her path.
6 months after the medal ceremony, Sarah found herself facing her most challenging mission yet, not because of enemy threats or mechanical failures, but because of the political firestorm that had erupted around her service and its implications for defense policy. A congressional subcommittee was conducting hearings on women in combat roles, and Sarah had been called to testify about her experiences and recommendations for future policy. The hearing room in Washington, D.C. was packed with politicians, military officials, advocates, and protesters representing every side of the debate about gender integration in combat forces. Sarah sat at the witness table in her dress uniform, the distinguished flying cross prominent among her decorations, facing a panel of lawmakers who would use her testimony to advance predetermined positions rather than seek genuine understanding of combat realities. Chairman Robert Hutchinson, a congressman known for his conservative views on military tradition, opened the questioning with barely concealed skepticism about the wisdom of placing women in direct combat roles. Captain Martinez, thank you for your service and for appearing before this committee today. Let me start with a direct question. Do you believe that your gender played any role in the tactical decisions you made during the missions that earned you recognition? Sarah had anticipated this line of questioning and had prepared her response carefully, knowing that every word would be analyzed and potentially taken out of context by advocates on both sides of the debate. Congressman, I believe my tactical decisions were based on training, experience, and assessment of mission requirements rather than any factor related to gender. Military decision-making in combat situations is driven by objective analysis of threats, capabilities, and mission parameters. But isn't it true that you deviated from established procedures during both of your most notable missions? Critics have suggested that this represents exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that makes women unsuitable for combat leadership roles. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the characterization, but maintained her professional composure. Sir, tactical flexibility and adaptation to changing conditions are fundamental requirements for effective combat operations. Both missions you reference involved dynamic situations where rigid adherence to predetermined plans would have resulted in mission failure and American casualties. Congresswoman Maria Santos, a former military officer herself, leaned forward with a more supportive tone. Captain Martinez, can you describe the specific training and preparation that enabled you to perform effectively under the extreme conditions you encountered?
Ma'am, my training was identical to that received by all combat aviators: flight school, advanced tactical training, survival instruction, and combat mission experience. The key factors in successful mission execution were technical proficiency, crew coordination, and thorough preparation rather than any physical or psychological characteristics specific to gender. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, with each committee member pursuing lines of inquiry that reflected their predetermined positions on women in combat. Sarah found herself defending not just her own actions, but the capabilities of all women seeking combat roles, while simultaneously trying to avoid making statements that could be used to justify exclusionary policies. During a brief recess, Sarah was approached by retired General Patricia Williams, who had traveled to Washington specifically to support Sarah's testimony. The general's presence carried significant weight with the committee, given her distinguished career and perspective as one of the first women to command combat aviation units. "Captain, you're handling this well. Remember that you're not just speaking for yourself. You're representing every woman who wants to serve in combat roles. Stay focused on facts and professional competence." "Ma'am, some of these questions feel designed to trap me into saying something that could be used against women in the military." "They are, but your service record speaks for itself. 8 Marines are alive because of your actions, and dozens of special operations personnel have completed successful missions with your support. Those are facts that can't be disputed by political rhetoric." When the hearing resumed, the questioning took a different direction as committee members sought to understand the broader implications of gender integration for military readiness and effectiveness. "Captain Martinez," asked Congressman David Torres, "based on your experience, what recommendations would you make for policies governing women in combat roles?" Sarah had thought carefully about this question, understanding that her response could influence policy decisions affecting thousands of current and future service members. "Sir, I recommend that combat roles be assigned based on individual qualifications, performance standards, and mission requirements, rather than categorical exclusions based on gender. Military effectiveness depends on having the most capable personnel in critical positions, regardless of demographic characteristics." "But don't physical differences between men and women create inherent limitations that must be considered?" "Congressman, military roles require diverse physical and mental capabilities. Some positions emphasize upper body strength, others require fine motor skills and spatial reasoning. The key is matching individual capabilities to specific job requirements, rather than making assumptions based on gender stereotypes." The most challenging moment came when Congressman Hutchinson presented what he clearly considered a devastating line of attack. "Captain Martinez, isn't it true that your heroic actions were motivated, at least partially, by a desire to prove that women belong in combat roles? And if so, doesn't that suggest that female service members might take unnecessary risks to validate their presence in previously male-dominated fields?" Sarah paused, recognizing the trap inherent in the question. Any acknowledgement of pressure to prove herself could be used to argue that women were unsuitable for combat roles due to emotional motivations, while denial might seem disingenuous given the obvious political implications of her service. "Sir, my actions were motivated by military duty and commitment to fellow service members who needed assistance. Every combat pilot faces pressure to perform effectively under dangerous conditions. That pressure comes from responsibility to teammates and mission success, rather than political considerations. But surely you were aware that your performance would be scrutinized as representative of women's capabilities in combat." Sarah met the congressman's gaze directly, her voice steady and clear. "Sir, I was aware of that scrutiny, but it didn't influence my tactical decisions. When Marines are under fire and calling for help, political considerations become irrelevant. The only questions that matter are, can you fly the mission? Can you get them out alive? Everything else is secondary." The hearing concluded with statements from various advocacy groups and military experts, but Sarah's testimony had provided the kind of first-hand, professional perspective that carried weight beyond political rhetoric.
As she left the Capitol building, Sarah was surrounded by reporters seeking additional comments and clarification on her positions. "Captain Martinez, do you think your testimony will change minds about women in combat?" asked a reporter from Military Times. "I hope it will focus the discussion on facts rather than assumptions," Sarah replied carefully. "Military effectiveness should be based on individual performance and capability rather than categorical exclusions based on gender."
The media coverage of the hearing was predictably polarized, with conservative outlets emphasizing the risks of social experimentation in military forces, while progressive publications celebrated Sarah's testimony as validation of gender equality in combat roles. But within the military community, the response was more nuanced and ultimately more important. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from fellow aviators, both male and female, expressing support for her testimony and appreciation for her focus on professional competence over political rhetoric. A text from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez captured the sentiment of many. "Ma'am, you nailed it. You kept it about the mission and the Marines. That's what matters." More significantly, Sarah began receiving inquiries from young women interested in military aviation careers, many of whom referenced her congressional testimony as inspiration for their own service aspirations. The letters and emails revealed a generation of potential service members who saw in Sarah's achievements proof that gender barriers could be overcome through preparation, performance, and perseverance. One letter particularly moved Sarah, a message from Lisa Chen, a sophomore at the Air Force Academy, who was pursuing a pilot track despite discouragement from some instructors who questioned women's suitability for combat aviation. "Captain Martinez, your testimony showed me that success in military aviation isn't about proving you belong. It's about being so good at your job that belonging becomes irrelevant. I want to be that kind of pilot, the one that other pilots call when missions are too important to fail." Reading Lisa's letter, Sarah realized that her service had achieved something more significant than individual recognition or political validation. She had helped create a pathway for women who wanted to serve in combat roles, demonstrating through performance rather than rhetoric that gender was irrelevant to military effectiveness when lives hung in the balance. But Sarah also understood that progress was fragile and could be reversed by any high-profile failure or mistake that critics could use to justify exclusionary policies. Every woman currently serving in combat roles carried the burden of representing not just herself, but all women seeking similar opportunities, a responsibility that required constant vigilance and exceptional performance. The weeks following the congressional hearing brought a return to operational routine, with Sarah resuming her role as a flight leader in Afghanistan while the political debates continued in Washington. But something had changed in the atmosphere around her service. Fellow pilots seemed more accepting of her presence and capabilities, while senior officers increasingly sought her input on tactical planning and crew assignments. The shift was subtle but significant. Recognition that Sarah had moved beyond the category of female pilot trying to prove herself to simply highly competent pilot whose gender happened to be irrelevant to mission effectiveness. It was exactly the kind of acceptance that she had sought throughout her career, validation based on professional performance rather than political symbolism. During a mission briefing for a complex special operations insertion, Colonel Richards assigned Sarah as the overall flight commander for a 6-aircraft formation, a level of responsibility that reflected complete confidence in her tactical judgment and leadership capabilities. "Martinez, you'll be running this show from start to finish," Colonel Richards said after the formal briefing concluded. "Special Operations Command specifically requested you for this mission based on your track record and tactical innovation." Sarah nodded, understanding that the assignment represented not just personal recognition, but institutional acceptance of women in combat leadership roles. The mission would be challenging, inserting Navy SEALs into hostile territory for a high-value target capture, but it was exactly the kind of operation that separated elite aviation units from conventional transport squadrons. As Sarah prepared for the mission, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of complete professional acceptance. From the doubting voices in flight school to the skeptical instructors, from the congressional hearing to the operational reality of leading complex combat missions, all of it had contributed to a gradual shift in perceptions about women's capabilities in warfare. The mission itself went flawlessly, with Sarah's formation inserting the Navy SEALs precisely on schedule and extracting them 12 hours later with their high-value target in custody. The operation demonstrated the kind of tactical coordination and professional execution that had become characteristic of Sarah's approach to combat aviation: thorough preparation, aggressive execution, and seamless teamwork that made gender considerations irrelevant. As Sarah's deployment in Afghanistan neared its end, she found herself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred not just in her own career, but in the broader military culture surrounding women in combat roles. The transformation had been gradual, but unmistakable, from initial skepticism and resistance to grudging acceptance, and finally to full recognition of capability based on performance rather than gender. The change was most evident in the attitudes of the Marines and soldiers she supported during combat operations, where once there had been whispered doubts about whether a female pilot could handle the pressure of combat extraction, there was now simply trust in Phoenix, a call sign that had become synonymous with reliable, professional aviation support regardless of the pilot's gender. Staff Sergeant Peterson, the Marine NCO whose squad Sarah had extracted from the valley 6 months earlier, approached her during her final week at the base. Peterson had recovered from his wounds and returned to duty, leading patrols in the same dangerous terrain where Sarah had first proven herself under fire. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you one more time before you head home," Peterson said, his expression serious. "But more than that, I wanted you to know what you've meant to my Marines." Sarah smiled, genuinely curious about his perspective on the changes that had occurred during her deployment. "What do you mean, Sergeant?" "When word first got around that we might have female pilots supporting our operations, some of the guys were skeptical. They figured it was political correctness that might get us killed when things went bad. But after that valley extraction, after seeing what you did to get us out of there, that all changed." Peterson paused, seeming to search for the right words to express complex thoughts about courage, competence, and the irrelevance of gender in combat situations. "Now when my Marines hear Phoenix on the radio, they know they've got the best pilot in the theater watching their backs. They don't think about whether you're male or female. They just know you'll come get them, no matter how bad things get. That's the highest compliment a grunt can give to aircrew." As Sarah prepared to return to the United States, she received orders assigning her to the Army's elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, an assignment that represented the pinnacle of military aviation and complete institutional acceptance of her capabilities. The 160th was legendary for its demanding selection standards and dangerous missions supporting the most sensitive special operations around the world. The assignment also carried broader significance for women seeking combat aviation roles. Sarah would be among the first female pilots to serve with the Night Stalkers, helping to integrate one of the military's most elite units while maintaining the exceptional performance standards that had defined her career. During her final mission in Afghanistan, a routine transport flight that seemed almost mundane after months of combat operations, Sarah found herself thinking about the young women who would follow in her path. Lieutenant Thompson, the eager young pilot she had mentored, was now flying combat missions with confidence and competence that reflected changed attitudes about women's capabilities. More importantly, Thompson was no longer seen as a female pilot, but simply as a pilot whose gender was irrelevant to mission effectiveness. It was exactly the kind of acceptance that Sarah had worked to achieve throughout her career, recognition based on professional performance rather than demographic characteristics. The transition to civilian life, even temporarily during leave, felt strange after months of operational tempo and life-or-death decision-making. Sarah found herself missing the clarity of purpose that characterized combat operations, where success was measured in lives saved and missions completed rather than political rhetoric and career advancement.
But she also recognized that her future service would carry different responsibilities. As one of the most visible examples of women's success in combat aviation, Sarah would inevitably be involved in training programs, policy development, and mentorship activities that would help integrate future generations of female aviators. The Army had already indicated that her assignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment would include instructor duties, helping to train new pilots, while participating in the most challenging missions that the Special Operations community could offer. It was exactly the kind of career progression that reflected complete professional acceptance while providing opportunities to influence the next generation of combat aviators. During her leave period, Sarah received dozens of letters from young women interested in military aviation careers, many of whom specifically reference her achievements as inspiration for their own service aspirations. The correspondence revealed a generation of potential aviators who saw in Sarah's success proof that gender barriers could be overcome through preparation, performance, and perseverance. One letter particularly moved her, a message from a high school student in Montana whose father is a career military officer, but had discouraged his daughter from pursuing aviation due to gender-related concerns. Captain Martinez, your story helped me convince my dad that women can be just as effective as men in combat roles. He's now supporting my application to the Air Force Academy, and I want to follow your example by being so good at my job that gender becomes irrelevant. Thank you for showing me that it's possible. Reading these letters, Sarah realized that her service had achieved something more significant than individual recognition or institutional change. She had helped create a pathway for women who wanted to serve in combat roles, demonstrating through performance that excellence was defined by capability rather than demographic characteristics. As her leave period ended and Sarah prepared to report to Fort Campbell for her new assignment with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small farming town in Nebraska to the elite ranks of military aviation. The path had been challenging, marked by skepticism and resistance that required constant proof of competence and capability. But the destination had validated every sacrifice and struggle along the way. Sarah was no longer fighting to prove that women belonged in combat aviation. She was simply a highly skilled pilot whose gender was irrelevant to mission effectiveness. It was exactly the kind of acceptance that Sarah had sought throughout her career, recognition based on professional performance rather than political symbolism. The future held new challenges and opportunities, from the demanding training pipeline of the Night Stalkers to the responsibility of mentoring young aviators who would carry forward the integration of women in combat roles. But Sarah approached these challenges with confidence earned through successful completion of the most dangerous missions that military aviation could offer. She had proven that courage, competence, and dedication were defined by individual character rather than demographic categories. In doing so, she had opened doors for countless women who shared her dream of serving their country in the most challenging and dangerous roles that military service could offer. The mission was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for a future where gender would be truly irrelevant to military effectiveness.
5 years after her deployment to Afghanistan, Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez stood in the briefing room at Fort Campbell, addressing a class of newly selected Night Stalker pilots who represented the next generation of special operations aviation. Among the eager faces looking back at her were 6 women, a number that would have been unimaginable when Sarah first entered military service, but had become routine as gender integration transformed military culture.
The transformation had been profound and irreversible. What had once been a contentious political debate about women's capabilities in combat had evolved into operational reality where gender was truly irrelevant to mission assignment and effectiveness. Sarah's achievements had contributed to that change, but more importantly, they had been built upon by hundreds of other women who had proven their competence in combat roles across all military services. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of combat experience and successful leadership in the military's most elite aviation unit, "welcome to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. You are here because you have demonstrated exceptional skill, dedication, and potential for service in the most challenging missions that military aviation can offer." Sarah paused, looking across the faces of pilots who would soon be flying the most dangerous missions in the darkest corners of the world. Among them was Captain Lisa Chen, the former Air Force Academy cadet who had written to Sarah years earlier and had now cross-trained to Army aviation, specifically to join the Night Stalkers. "Your selection for this unit is based on one criterion: your ability to complete missions that others cannot. Gender, race, background, and personal circumstances are irrelevant to mission effectiveness. What matters is whether you can fly in conditions that would challenge the most experienced aviators and whether you can be trusted with the lives of America's most elite warriors." The briefing continued with technical details about aircraft systems, operational procedures, and training timelines that would transform these already accomplished pilots into members of the military's most elite aviation community. But Sarah's mind drifted to the broader significance of the moment, a generation of aviators for whom gender integration was simply operational reality rather than political controversy. After the briefing concluded, Captain Chen approached Sarah with the same eager intensity that had characterized her correspondence years earlier, but now she carried herself with the confidence of a pilot who had proven her capabilities in combat operations and earned her place among the military's elite through performance rather than advocacy. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for the example you set," Chen said, her voice reflecting genuine appreciation rather than the hero worship that had characterized some earlier interactions. "But more than that, I wanted you to know that your legacy isn't just about opening doors, it's about proving that excellence has no gender." Sarah smiled, recognizing in Chen the same determination and focus that had driven her own career development. "Captain, the most important thing you can do now is be the best pilot possible. Master your aircraft, trust your training, and always remember that your job is to bring Americans home safely. Everything else will take care of itself." That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters and found a letter waiting from the Department of Defense informing her that she had been selected for promotion to full colonel and assignment as commander of the 160th training program. The position represented not just personal achievement, but institutional recognition that women had become fully integrated into the military's most elite combat units. The letter also contained a note from the Secretary of the Army, acknowledging Sarah's role in transforming military culture and creating opportunities for future generations of female service members. But to Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from the operational successes of pilots she had trained and mentored, young aviators who were now flying the most dangerous missions with competence that validated years of advocacy and struggle. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now a Master Sergeant, serving as a senior instructor with the 160th training program. "Ma'am, congratulations on the promotion and new assignment," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had shared life-threatening experiences and watched career development with genuine pride. "Well deserved." "Thank you, Rodriguez. How are the new students looking?" "Outstanding, ma'am. The women in this class are some of the finest pilots I've ever worked with. They're not here to prove anything. They're here because they're the best candidates available." It was exactly the kind of acceptance that Sarah had worked to achieve throughout her career. Recognition based on professional performance rather than demographic characteristics. The political debates about women in combat had been settled not through rhetoric, but through operational success that made gender considerations irrelevant. As Sarah prepared for her new responsibilities as training commander, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small farming town in Nebraska to leadership of the military's most elite aviation training program. The path had required constant proof of competence and capability, but it had also created opportunities for women who share her commitment to service in the most challenging roles. The transformation extended far beyond individual career advancement. Military culture had evolved to embrace the reality that combat effectiveness was determined by individual capability rather than categorical assumptions about gender limitations. Women now served in every combat role, from infantry to special operations, with acceptance based on performance rather than political accommodation. But Sarah also understood that maintaining this progress required continued excellence from women serving in combat roles. Every successful mission strengthened the foundation for full integration, while any significant failure could be exploited by critics seeking to justify exclusionary policies. The burden of representation remained, but it was now shared among thousands of women rather than concentrated on a few pioneers. The next morning brought Sarah's first staff meeting as training commander, where she would oversee the development of curricula and standards that would prepare the next generation of special operations aviators. Among her responsibilities would be ensuring that training programs reflected the realities of modern warfare, while maintaining the exceptional standards that had made the Night Stalkers legendary. During the meeting, Sarah emphasized that training standards must be based on operational requirements rather than assumptions about demographic capabilities. Our mission is to produce pilots who can complete any mission under any conditions, she told her staff. Individual performance is the only measure that matters. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm of training operations, curriculum development, and mentorship activities that defined Sarah's new role. She found particular satisfaction in working with young female aviators who approached their training with confidence rather than the defensive attitude that had characterized earlier generations of women seeking combat roles. One evening, while reviewing training records in her office, Sarah received a video call from her parents in Nebraska. Her father's weathered face filled the screen, pride evident in his expression as he held up a local newspaper featuring a story about Sarah's promotion and new assignment. "We're proud of you, Sarah," her father said, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of someone who had watched his daughter overcome institutional skepticism through dedication and performance. "But more than that, we're proud of what you've made possible for other young women." Sarah smiled, thinking about the high school students who now saw military aviation as a realistic career option rather than an impossible dream. "Dad, I just did my job. The real credit goes to all the women who are serving now, proving every day that excellence has no gender." As the call ended, Sarah returned to her work with renewed appreciation for the journey that had brought her to this position of leadership and influence. The political debates about women in combat had been settled through operational success rather than theoretical arguments. Gender integration was now simply military reality rather than social experiment. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that young women could now pursue military aviation careers without facing the institutional skepticism that had characterized her own early service. They would be evaluated based on individual capability rather than categorical assumptions about categorical limitations. They would be competing for assignments based on merit rather than fighting for the right to serve. The mission was complete, but the responsibility continued. As training commander for the military's most elite aviation unit, Sarah would help prepare the next generation of pilots to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Gender would be irrelevant to their preparation, just as it had become irrelevant to their opportunities for service. Late that night, as Sarah walked across the base toward her quarters, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters conducting night training operations. The pilots flying those aircraft included both men and women, all held to identical standards and all committed to the same mission of bringing Americans home safely. It was exactly the kind of military that Sarah had envisioned when she first decided to pursue aviation. One where capability mattered more than demographics, where courage was measured by actions rather than assumptions, and where the only question that mattered was whether you could do the job when lives hung in the balance.
The girl from Nebraska who had dreamed of flying had become a colonel who was shaping the future of military aviation. But more importantly, she had helped create a military where gender was truly irrelevant to service opportunities and where young women could pursue their dreams without facing the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. The story was complete, but the legacy would continue through every woman who followed in Sarah's path, every mission completed successfully, and every life saved by pilots whose gender was irrelevant to their courage and competence. They had proven that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to claim it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.